Part 1. The night sky above the Pacific was calm, almost peaceful. Thousands of miles away from the front lines of Europe, the United States believed the war would remain distant. Hawaii was warm, quiet, and far from the brutal battlefields that had already consumed much of the world. But in early December of 1941, a massive Japanese fleet was already moving silently across the Pacific Ocean. 6 aircraft carriers formed the core of the strike force. On their decks sat hundreds of aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Each pilot had spent months preparing for a mission that would change the course of history. Their target was Pearl Harbor. The harbor was home to the main force of the United States Pacific Fleet. Battleships lined the docks in long rows. Sailors carried out their usual Sunday routines. Some were sleeping, others eating breakfast, many completely unaware that an enemy strike force was already approaching. Shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning, radar operators detected aircraft approaching the island. The signal was dismissed as a group of expected American planes arriving from the mainland. Moments later, the first Japanese aircraft appeared in the sky. The attack began instantly. Torpedo bombers dropped low over the water, racing toward the harbor. Dive bombers screamed down toward the battleships anchored below. Explosions ripped through the morning air as bombs struck the ships and torpedoes slammed into their hulls. Sailors ran across burning decks trying to man anti-aircraft guns. Within minutes, the harbor was filled with fire and smoke. One of the most devastating moments came when a bomb struck the USS Arizona. The explosion ignited the ship's ammunition magazines, creating a massive blast that tore the battleship apart. Flames and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air. More than 1,000 sailors were trapped inside. Across the harbor, other ships were hit again and again. The battleships Oklahoma and West Virginia rolled over after taking multiple torpedo hits. Aircraft on nearby airfields were destroyed before they could even take off. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. When it ended, the damage was catastrophic. 8 battleships had been damaged or sunk. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed. More than 2,400 Americans had been killed. But one critical target had not been destroyed. The American aircraft carriers, the most important ships in the Pacific Fleet, were not in the harbor that morning. And that small detail would soon change the entire course of the war. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States. What had once been a distant conflict across oceans had now become a truly global war, and the Pacific was about to become one of its most brutal battlefields. Part 2. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States moved into the war with a determination that surprised even its own allies. Across the country, factories were converted to wartime production almost overnight. Car plants began producing tanks. Steel plants expanded their output. Shipyards started constructing entire fleets of warships at an unprecedented pace. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japanese forces were advancing rapidly. Within weeks, they attacked multiple targets across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean. Hong Kong fell after intense fighting. British defenses in Malaya were overwhelmed. One of the most shocking defeats came when Singapore, a heavily fortified British stronghold, surrendered in February 1942. To many observers, it appeared that the Japanese Empire was unstoppable. Japanese naval aviation had proven devastatingly effective. Their pilots were highly trained and experienced from years of warfare in China. Their aircraft were fast, maneuverable, and capable of long-range missions across the vast Pacific. American commanders understood that the only way to stop Japanese expansion was to challenge their navy directly. That opportunity came in June 1942, near a small island called Midway. Midway Atoll sat roughly halfway between North America and Asia. Although it was a small and remote location, its strategic importance was enormous. Control of Midway could provide a base for further operations across the Pacific. Japanese commanders planned to capture the island and destroy the remaining American aircraft carriers that had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor. But American intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications and decoded critical parts of their plan. For the first time since the war began in the Pacific, American commanders knew where the enemy fleet would appear. They positioned their carriers north of Midway, waiting for the Japanese strike force. On June 4, 1942, the battle began. Japanese aircraft attacked the island, bombing its airfields and defensive positions. At the same time, American aircraft launched from Midway attempted to attack the Japanese fleet. Many of these early attacks failed, and several aircraft were shot down. Yet the repeated assaults forced Japanese fighter planes to remain low and occupied. Meanwhile, American dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown were approaching the fleet from high altitude. When they arrived above the Japanese ships, they found something extraordinary. The Japanese aircraft carriers were in the middle of preparing another strike. Their decks were filled with fueled aircraft and armed bombs. Within minutes, American dive bombers began their attack. Bombs slammed into the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu almost simultaneously. Massive fires erupted across their decks as explosions spread through the ships. A fourth carrier, Hiryu, attempted to counterattack, but was later found and destroyed as well. In a single day, Japan had lost 4 of its most powerful aircraft carriers, along with many of its best naval pilots. The Battle of Midway became one of the most decisive naval battles in history. It marked the first major strategic defeat for Japan in the Pacific War. From that moment forward, the balance of power in the Pacific slowly began to shift. The United States, with its enormous industrial capacity, began producing new ships and aircraft faster than Japan could replace its losses. But the road to victory would still be long and costly. Ahead lay brutal battles across hundreds of islands scattered across the Pacific Ocean. Battles that would test the endurance of soldiers, sailors, and pilots on both sides of the war. Part 3. After the Battle of Midway, the momentum of the Pacific War began to shift slowly but decisively. The Japanese Navy had lost 4 of its most experienced aircraft carriers, along with hundreds of highly trained pilots. These losses were devastating because Japan did not have the industrial capacity to replace ships and trained air crews as quickly as the United States. American shipyards, meanwhile, were producing new carriers, destroyers, and submarines at a remarkable speed. Entire fleets were being constructed in months rather than years. The next stage of the war would involve pushing Japanese forces back across the vast chain of islands that stretched across the Pacific Ocean. The first major test of this strategy came on a remote island called Guadalcanal. Located in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal might have seemed insignificant at first glance. It was covered in dense jungle, surrounded by coral reefs, and far from major population centers. But the island had enormous strategic value. Japanese engineers had begun building an airfield there that could threaten Allied supply routes between the United States and Australia. If Japan completed the airfield, it would become much more difficult for the Allies to move troops and supplies across the Pacific. In August 1942, American forces launched their first major offensive of the Pacific War. Marines landed on the beaches of Guadalcanal and quickly captured the unfinished airfield. The airstrip was renamed Henderson Field and immediately became the focus of intense fighting. Japanese forces were determined to retake the island. Over the following months, the battle for Guadalcanal turned into one of the most exhausting and brutal campaigns of the war. Fighting took place not only on land, but also in the surrounding seas and skies. At night, Japanese destroyers rushed down what American sailors began calling the Tokyo Express, delivering reinforcements and supplies under the cover of darkness. Naval battles erupted in the waters around the island, often fought at extremely close range. Meanwhile, soldiers on the ground struggled against more than just enemy forces. The jungle environment was harsh and unforgiving. Tropical heat, heavy rain, and thick vegetation made movement difficult. Malaria and other diseases spread rapidly among troops on both sides. Food and supplies were often scarce. Despite these challenges, the Marines held their positions around Henderson Field. American aircraft, operating from the airstrip, played a crucial role in defending the island during daylight hours, attacking Japanese ships and troop movements. The fighting continued for 6 long months. Japanese forces launched multiple major assaults against the American defensive lines, often attacking at night through the jungle. These attacks resulted in fierce close-quarters combat, where soldiers fought with rifles, grenades, and sometimes even knives. But each time, the attacks were repelled. Gradually, Japanese commanders realized the situation was becoming unsustainable. Their troops were suffering heavy losses, and supplying the island had become extremely difficult due to American air and naval power. In early 1943, Japan made the difficult decision to evacuate its remaining forces from Guadalcanal. The battle was over. Guadalcanal became the first major land victory for the United States in the Pacific War. It proved that Japanese forces could be pushed back and defeated. More importantly, it marked the beginning of a new Allied strategy known as island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-controlled island, Allied forces would focus on capturing key strategic locations. These islands would then serve as bases for aircraft and naval forces to move closer and closer to Japan itself. Each new island captured brought the Allies one step closer to the Japanese homeland. But the battles ahead would become even more intense. Some of the fiercest fighting of the entire Pacific War was still to come. Part 4. As the Allied strategy of island hopping moved forward across the Pacific, each captured island brought American forces closer to Japan itself. Airfields built on newly secured islands allowed bombers to reach deeper into enemy territory, while naval bases provided staging points for future invasions. But every new landing came with enormous cost. Japanese military doctrine emphasized fighting to the last soldier. Surrender was considered dishonorable, and many units were ordered to defend their positions until death. As a result, battles in the Pacific often became extremely intense and destructive. One of the most famous examples of this brutal warfare occurred on a small volcanic island known as Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima lies roughly halfway between the Mariana Islands and Japan. Although the island was small, only about 8 square miles, it held tremendous strategic importance. Japanese radar stations on the island could warn the mainland when American bombers were approaching. Additionally, the island's airfields allowed Japanese fighters to intercept incoming bombing missions. American commanders believed that capturing Iwo Jima would eliminate these defenses and provide an emergency landing site for damaged bombers returning from missions over Japan. But the Japanese defenders had spent months preparing their defenses. Instead of building exposed fortifications along the beaches, Japanese engineers constructed an extensive network of underground tunnels, bunkers, and hidden artillery positions. These defensive structures were carved directly into the volcanic rock of the island. From these concealed positions, Japanese soldiers could move unseen beneath the surface and launch surprise attacks. When American forces landed on February 19, 1945, they encountered fierce resistance almost immediately. The volcanic sand on the beaches made movement extremely difficult. Vehicles struggled to gain traction, and soldiers found it hard to dig protective foxholes. As the Marines advanced inland, hidden Japanese artillery and machine guns opened fire from fortified positions. Progress was slow and costly. Each bunker had to be cleared individually. Flamethrowers, grenades, and explosives were used to eliminate defensive positions. Even after heavy bombardment from naval guns and aircraft, many Japanese fortifications remained intact. The fighting continued for weeks. One of the most iconic moments of the battle occurred on Mount Suribachi, a steep volcanic hill at the southern end of the island. After intense combat, American Marines captured the summit and raised the United States flag. A photograph taken during the second flag raising became one of the most famous images of the entire war. But even after Mount Suribachi was secured, the battle was far from over. Japanese defenders continued fighting from the island's northern sectors, using their underground tunnels to launch surprise attacks and relocate between defensive positions. Many refused to surrender even when their situation became hopeless. By the time the battle ended in March 1945, the cost had been staggering. Nearly 7,000 American Marines had been killed, and more than 20,000 were wounded. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders on the island, only a few hundred survived. The Battle of Iwo Jima demonstrated how fiercely Japan would defend territory close to its homeland. For Allied commanders, the battle raised a troubling question. If such fierce resistance had occurred on a small island like Iwo Jima, what would happen if Allied forces attempted to invade the Japanese mainland itself? The answer would soon become clearer during another brutal battle, one that would become the final and bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. Part 5. After the costly victory at Iwo Jima, Allied commanders continued moving closer to Japan. Each captured island allowed bombers and naval forces to operate nearer to the Japanese mainland. Yet every step forward also revealed how fiercely Japanese forces were prepared to fight. The next objective would become the largest and bloodiest battle of the entire Pacific War. The island was Okinawa. Located only about 550 kilometers from the Japanese mainland, Okinawa held enormous strategic importance. If captured, it could serve as a major base for aircraft, troops, and supplies for a potential invasion of Japan itself. Both sides understood the stakes. For the United States, Okinawa was the final stepping stone before Japan. For the Japanese military, it represented the last defensive barrier protecting the homeland. Japanese commanders knew they could not stop the massive American fleet approaching the island through conventional naval battles. Instead, they prepared a different strategy. They would defend the island as long as possible and inflict maximum casualties on the invading forces. The Japanese army built a series of defensive positions in the southern part of Okinawa. Rather than defending the beaches directly, they constructed fortified lines within hills, caves, and underground bunkers. These positions allowed soldiers to survive heavy bombardment and continue fighting even after intense attacks. Meanwhile, Japan introduced a terrifying new weapon: kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze means divine wind, and it referred to pilots who deliberately crashed explosive-filled aircraft into enemy ships. These suicide missions were intended to sink warships and slow the American advance. On April 1st, 1945, American forces began the invasion of Okinawa. More than 1,300 ships supported the operation, making it one of the largest amphibious assaults of the entire war. Thousands of soldiers landed on the beaches during the first day. At first, the landings encountered surprisingly little resistance, but the real battle began when American troops moved south toward the Japanese defensive lines. There, they encountered one of the most heavily fortified battle zones of the Pacific War. Japanese artillery fired from hidden caves and reinforced bunkers. Machine gun nests covered narrow approaches through hills and ridges. Every advance required careful coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery support. The fighting quickly became slow and brutal. Heavy rain turned the battlefield into thick mud. Tanks struggled to move across the terrain, while soldiers fought through fortified ridges under constant enemy fire. At sea, the American fleet faced another deadly threat. Hundreds of kamikaze aircraft launched attacks against the ships supporting the invasion. These suicide missions caused severe damage. Several ships were sunk, and many others were heavily damaged. Sailors aboard destroyers and carriers watched as incoming aircraft deliberately dove toward them at high speed. Anti-aircraft guns fired continuously in desperate attempts to stop the attacks. Despite the fierce defense, American forces slowly pushed forward. Weeks of fighting wore down the Japanese defensive positions. Supplies became scarce, and many Japanese soldiers continued fighting even when surrounded. Civilians on the island were also caught in the middle of the battle. Thousands were killed as the fighting spread across villages and towns. By June 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa finally collapsed. The victory had come at an enormous cost. More than 12,000 American soldiers had been killed and tens of thousands wounded. Japanese military losses were far higher, and many civilians had died during the battle. For Allied commanders, Okinawa provided a grim preview of what an invasion of mainland Japan might look like. Military planners estimated that such an invasion could result in hundreds of thousands, or even millions, of casualties. As the war continued, American leaders began considering other ways to force Japan to surrender. Meanwhile, a secret project thousands of miles away had been developing a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. Part 6. While the brutal fighting continued across the Pacific, a secret project had been unfolding far from the battlefields. Deep within laboratories and remote testing sites across the United States, thousands of scientists and engineers were working on something that had never existed before. The project was known as the Manhattan Project. It began in 1942 after scientists warned that Nazi Germany might be attempting to build an atomic weapon. The idea was based on nuclear fission, a process in which the splitting of atoms releases enormous amounts of energy. If controlled properly, this reaction could create a bomb far more powerful than any weapon previously invented. The United States government invested massive resources into the project. Entire cities were built in secret to house laboratories and production facilities. One of the most important sites was Los Alamos in New Mexico, where scientists worked to design the bomb itself. Many of the world's leading physicists were involved, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, who directed the scientific effort. For years, the work remained completely secret. Even many high-ranking military officers had no knowledge of the program. Scientists struggled with complex calculations, engineering challenges, and the unknown dangers of nuclear reactions. Finally, in July 1945, the first atomic device was ready for testing. In the early morning hours of July 16th, scientists gathered in the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico. They had constructed a test bomb atop a tall tower. The test was codenamed Trinity. When the device detonated, the explosion produced a blinding flash of light brighter than the sun. A massive fireball rose into the sky, followed by a towering mushroom-shaped cloud. The shock wave from the blast could be felt miles away. For the first time in history, humanity had unleashed the power of the atom. At that moment, the war in Europe had already ended with Germany's surrender in May 1945. But the conflict in the Pacific continued. Japanese forces were still fighting fiercely despite heavy losses and the destruction of many cities by conventional bombing. American leaders faced a difficult decision. Invading Japan directly could result in enormous casualties on both sides. The recent Battle of Okinawa had demonstrated how fiercely Japanese forces would defend territory close to their homeland. President Harry Truman, who had taken office after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945, now had to decide whether to use the new weapon. After weeks of deliberation, the decision was made. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay took off from the island of Tinian in the Pacific. Its destination was the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomber released a single atomic bomb over the city. Seconds later, the weapon detonated approximately 600 meters above the ground. The explosion produced an enormous fireball that instantly destroyed much of the city. Buildings were flattened by the blast. Intense heat ignited fires across a wide area, and shock waves shattered structures miles away. Within moments, tens of thousands of people were killed. Despite the devastating destruction, the Japanese government did not immediately surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. At the same time, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-controlled territories in Manchuria. Faced with overwhelming military pressure and the terrifying power of the new weapon, Japanese leaders realized the war could no longer continue. The final decision about surrender was now approaching. Part 7. By August 1945, the Japanese Empire stood on the brink of collapse. Years of war had devastated its navy, destroyed much of its air force, and crippled its industrial capacity. Allied submarines had cut off shipping routes, leaving the country with severe shortages of fuel, food, and raw materials. Cities across Japan had already suffered enormous destruction from conventional bombing campaigns. Night after night, American B-29 bombers flew over the Japanese mainland, dropping incendiary bombs that created massive firestorms. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash. Yet despite these devastating attacks, Japan had not surrendered. Many leaders within the Japanese military believed the country should continue fighting. They hoped that if Japan inflicted enough casualties during an Allied invasion of the mainland, it might force the United States to negotiate a more favorable peace. But the situation changed dramatically after August 1945. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shocked the Japanese leadership. Reports arriving from the destroyed cities described unimaginable destruction. Entire districts had vanished. Fires burned across the ruins, and tens of thousands of people had been killed in seconds. Even more alarming was the realization that the United States might possess more of these weapons. At the same time, another unexpected development occurred. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. For years, Japan had hoped that the Soviet Union might help negotiate a peace agreement with the Allies. Instead, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive against Japanese armies stationed in Manchuria. These forces were quickly overwhelmed by the rapid Soviet advance. Now Japan faced defeat on every front. Inside the Japanese government, intense debates erupted about whether to surrender. Some military leaders argued that the nation should continue fighting no matter the cost. Others believed that further resistance would only lead to the complete destruction of the country. Ultimately, the final decision rested with Emperor Hirohito. For the first time in modern Japanese history, the emperor directly intervened in political decision-making. After reviewing the situation and hearing reports about the devastation caused by the atomic bombs, he concluded that continuing the war would bring only greater suffering to the Japanese people. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation in a radio broadcast. For many Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice. In the announcement, he explained that Japan would accept the terms of surrender proposed by the Allied powers. Although the message was delivered in formal language, its meaning was clear. The war was over. Across Japan, soldiers and civilians listened in stunned silence. The conflict that had consumed the nation for years had finally come to an end. In the following weeks, Japanese forces across Asia and the Pacific began surrendering to Allied commanders. Ships lowered their flags. Military units laid down their weapons. The official surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the American battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Representatives of the Japanese government signed the formal surrender documents in the presence of Allied leaders. With those signatures, the Second World War officially ended. But the aftermath of the conflict would shape the world for decades to come. Part 8. When the Second World War finally ended in September 1945, the scale of destruction across the world was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire cities had been flattened by bombing. Industrial regions lay in ruins. Millions of families had lost homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. Across Europe and Asia, Soldiers slowly returned home from battlefields that had stretched across continents. Many had spent years in combat. Others returned from prisoner of war camps. For countless families, however, the war ended with empty chairs at the table and names carved into memorials. In total, the conflict had claimed the lives of more than 60 million people. Many of those killed were civilians. Bombing campaigns, massacres, forced labor, famine, and disease had devastated populations far beyond the front lines. The Holocaust, carried out by Nazi Germany, had resulted in the systematic murder of millions of Jews and other persecuted groups. The war forced the world to confront the consequences of industrialized violence on a global scale. In the aftermath, nations began trying to rebuild both physically and politically. Europe faced enormous challenges. Factories had been destroyed, transportation networks shattered, and economies collapsed. Millions of refugees were moving across borders searching for stability. To support recovery, the United States introduced the Marshall Plan in 1948. This program provided massive financial assistance to rebuild European infrastructure, industry, and agriculture. The aid helped stabilize Western Europe and allowed many countries to recover far faster than expected. At the same time, a new geopolitical rivalry was beginning to emerge. Two nations now stood as the most powerful forces in the world: the United States and the Soviet Union. Both had played decisive roles in defeating Nazi Germany, but their political systems were fundamentally different. The United States supported democratic governments and market economies. The Soviet Union promoted communist systems under centralized state control. These differences quickly evolved into political tension. Europe itself became divided between two spheres of influence. Western European countries aligned with the United States, while Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. This division would become known as the beginning of the Cold War. Instead of direct large-scale battles between the two superpowers, the Cold War would involve political rivalry, military alliances, technological competition, and proxy conflicts around the world. Another major development was the creation of international institutions designed to prevent future global wars. In 1945, representatives from many nations gathered to establish the United Nations. The organization aimed to promote diplomacy, cooperation, and peaceful resolution of conflicts between countries. Although global tensions would continue for decades, the hope was that international dialogue might prevent another war on the scale of 1939 to 1945. The Second World War had reshaped the entire global order. Colonial empires began to collapse as many nations in Asia and Africa sought independence. Technological advancements developed during the war, including radar, jet aircraft, and nuclear technology, transformed both military and civilian industries. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the war was the lesson it left behind. The conflict demonstrated how quickly political tensions, economic crises, and extremist ideologies could lead to catastrophic global violence. For historians, soldiers, and civilians alike, the memory of the Second World War remains a reminder of both humanity's capacity for destruction and its determination to rebuild. The war ended in 1945, but the world it created would influence global history for generations.